Hello, my name is Colton Rieger, and this is my benchmark assignment for kinesiology lab. Thank you for watching. The movement I chose to do was a standing backflip or a back tuck, and here's a video of me performing the movement with both a lateral and an anterior view. So the movement depiction is that we start in a neutral position, your traditional athletic stance, knees bent, feet forward. And in my picture, I have my hands at my side because this is the beginning of my downward shoulder extension, but it really doesn't matter. You usually don't see people doing it with neutral wrists, so a little pronation is expected. This is kind of a modified vertical jump. So we're going to see the traditional preparation, propulsion, flight, and landing, but all we're adding is a 360 backward inverted rotation, and then we're trying to land back where our feet started or a few feet behind. The purpose of this movement is to utilize the stretch shortening cycle and store elastic energy in our knees and ankles through the counter movement jump where we go down and then spring forward up. We also are able to decelerate a very high velocity movement, and it also trains our knees to land in a safe manner. Next, we're going to do an anatomical breakdown while we go through the 4 phases of the movement, beginning with the preparation phase. This is where we focus on the counter movement portion, where we see flexion in the knees and hips and dorsiflexion in the ankles. The purpose of this is to store potential elastic energy in our tendons that we can transmit into kinetic energy. In the next stage, we have the propulsive phase, or the power amplification phase. And this is where we use all that elastic energy that we stored in the counter movement jump and are transmitting it concentrically into this high power jump. We're really going to focus on high vertical power and high angular velocity power. Next, we have the flight phase, and this is where we deviate from the traditional vertical jump because we are focusing now on that 360 inverted backward rotation. In this, we're trying to use our core to stabilize our bodies and also understand where we are proprioceptively so that we can land on our feet. Finally, we have the landing or the power attenuation phase, and this is where we have this high velocity in our mass and we have to decelerate it and make sure we don't harm our bodies. And so as you see, we have our mass and it goes from our tendons into our muscles, safely decelerating the movement, and it's also allowing us to transfer our ground reaction forces efficiently. Next, we're going to talk about the musculoskeletal terminology. There's 4 main joints that are utilized during the standing backflip. First is our talocrural ligament, which is our ankle. It does primary plantar flexion and dorsiflexion in our movement. It's a hinge joint, and you can see from the first to last picture, we start in dorsiflexion and then end in plantar flexion. Next, we have our tibiofemoral joint, which is our knee joint. It does some internal external rotation, but for our movement, we see mainly flexion and extension, and that again, first picture is flexion all the way to a triple extension. Next, we have the acetabulofemoral joint, which is the ball and socket hip joint. Similar to the knee, it does other movements, but we're mainly concerned with flexion and extension. In the picture, we have flexion all the way to extension. And then finally, the glenohumeral joint, which is our shoulder, that does a large range of shoulder flexion, which makes that angular velocity that allows us to do the flip and turn around in the air. Next, we're going to look at the muscles primarily involved in the movement. We have 6 right here, and I'll go through the actions, but the origins and insertions are also included. The gluteus maximus is our main hip extensor. The quadricep is our knee flexor and knee extensor and does some hip flexion. The gastrocnemius is our main plantar flexor. We have our hamstrings, which is our hip flexor, and it does that mostly eccentrically. The core muscles, which engage isometrically to stabilize us while we're in the air. And then finally the deltoid, which does both our extension and flexion of our shoulder during the movement. The muscle contraction types are pretty uniform throughout each phase. We have the preparatory phase where we see eccentric loading in our quads, our glutes, and our calves. Then through the propulsive phase, we're concentric through those same muscles, the quads, the calves, and the glutes. In the flight phase, we're mainly isometric in the core while we're controlling our flip. And then finally, And we also have some hip flexion that brings our knees to our chest, that allows for that further angular velocity. And then finally in landing, just like in preparation, we're eccentrically controlling our body's mass as we're landing on the ground and interacting with those ground reaction forces. When discussing the muscle roles in the standing backflip, it's important to understand the agonist, antagonist, stabilizers, and synergists. The agonists are the quads, the glute maxes, and the calves. The main antagonists are our hip flexors during triple extension. The main stabilizers are the core muscles in your glute medius, and the primary synergists are the hamstrings. When looking at the functional anatomy analysis, we're going to use some of our key concepts from our kinesiology class to break down what's going on in this motion. First, looking at the force velocity curve, we see that a high force is often associated with a low velocity, and a high velocity is associated with a low force. Since the backflip happens in such a high velocity, I put the X where I assumed this movement would land, where it's a much more velocity concentric movement rather than a high force, low velocity eccentric movement. Next, we're looking at passive and active insufficiencies. There's two instances where we can see this for both examples. When looking at active insufficiency, when someone is going from propulsion into flight, since you're in triple extension, your quadriceps are going to be completely flexed, but they're also a hip flexor, so that when we need to go into knee flexion to begin that tuck, there's not going to be as much contribution from the rectus femoris because it's already done all it can to extend the hips, extend the knees. Next, for passive insufficiency, we're going to look at the hamstrings. For example, if someone had tight hamstrings, they may not be able to get full hip flexion because that is a limiting factor. But once you bend your knees, you're taking some of that stretch out from the lower portion of the hamstring, and it can almost donate it to the upper part so that more hip flexion can occur. More examples from class on how to classify a movement through the use of kinesiology is the understanding of the stretch shortening cycle, which is a very key part of this movement since it is just like the vertical jump. The stretch shortening cycle is our body's ability to lengthen tendons, then store elastic energy, and then during an amortization phase, it can turn that into a powerful concentric that aids in the force that we can provide. Next, we're looking at the length-tension relationship. We know that our muscles prove optimal force when at a resting potential, but we also know that there's a passive force that our muscles can use once we've used all the active force. For example, when you go down, you're going to store elastic energy in the Achilles tendon, so that when we flex, it'll provide force in triple extension, but also the passive force that comes from our elastic energy will also recoil, providing force that allows our knees to get over our head during the backflip. In all movements, there are optimal ranges for it to occur in, and I've broken those down as seen right here. In our hips, we're doing 120 degrees of flexion, and that's in the bottoming out, and then 20 degrees of extension, and that's in triple extension, changing from propulsion into flight. Next, we have knee flexion, which is 135, and that's again at our bottom, and then 0, because we go into full, almost hyperextension when we're transitioning into flight. Ankle dorsiflexion is about 20, that's at the bottom, and 50 is at, again, propulsion into flight. And then shoulders, we use a whole 180 degrees of flexion. That makes sense because we go from extension into rapid flexion to create that angular momentum, which allows us to flip backwards. Next, we're going to look at the levers that we've discussed in class. To classify joints, we use the FRE 1-2-3 method, where the fulcrum's in the middle in a first class lever, the resistance in the middle for a second class lever, and the efforts in the middle for a third class lever. In the backflip, we see one first class lever, and that's our vertebrae, with the fulcrum in the middle for flexion and extension. The second class lever that we see is our ankle, and that's where the resistance or the load is in the middle, and it's a very efficient joint with high mechanical advantage because the effort is far away from the fulcrum. And finally, we have the third class lever, which is the most common in the human body, which is our knees, hips, and shoulders, where the effort is in the middle. And this is our least advantageous joint because the effort is so close to our fulcrum. The next concept we're going to talk about is the moment arm. The moment arm is the distance from the fulcrum to the line of action of a force. As seen in the picture, we see the man who is holding the same weight, but as the moment arm increases, he has to do more work to stabilize it. To quantify it, we use the equation torque equals force times distance, where distance is our moment arm, and since it's multiplication, a higher moment arm will increase more torque. And finally, we see the quadriceps as the moment arm around the knee during our back flip. Here is an example of me using the torque equation to determine how many nanometers or Newton meters of work that we're doing. I also felt like this was pertinent, showing a picture of Shaq next to Simone Biles. Seeing as she is one of the best gymnasts ever, we see this as an application of a smaller moment arm being able to create more angular momentum, and she's a much more efficient mover. But Shaq is one of the greatest basketball players of all time. So this is just an example of how different body sizes affect the sport or profession that some people go into. When looking at the internal and external forces in the backflip, we focus in on the internal forces, which are the force that our muscles can produce eccentrically or concentrically, the elastic energy stored in our tendons, and then also the stabilization in our ligaments, such as the LCL and PCL, keeping our knee in place. External forces such as gravity and ground reaction forces also play into how this movement gets performed. These images of the trampoline, grass field, and concrete are 3 different surfaces that people will learn how to do a movement on. The trampoline provides maximal amount of recoil from the force you put down and will allow you to spring up higher, which is why many people learn how to do this, because it provides them with some external force of the springs. Then people will graduate to a turf or grass field where they aren't able to energy isn't returned as efficiently, but if you were to make a mistake, it's a softer landing and you're less likely to get injured. And then finally, a hard surface like concrete, you'll be able to have a lot of recoil from the energy you put down, which is Newton's 3rd law, but it also provides the most risk because if you were to mess up, you could easily hurt yourself. Next, we're going to look at force vectors and free body diagrams. These were taught to me by Dr. Mortensen, so I felt the need to shout him out. The picture on the left is someone showing what's going on with a stick figure and a kind of a CAD model of someone performing a backflip. But that other picture is my free body diagram of someone doing a backflip, and I noted 5 different velocities or vectors. We have the force of gravity, which is a constant, always pushing us down. And then we have the force that we push into the ground, the force that we create with our hip extensors. And then also we create some angular momentum with our arms for the upper body, and then we create angular momentum through our legs with the lower body when we flex our hips and bring our knees to our chest during the tuck portion of our flight phase. Okay. When looking at Newton's 3 laws, we can better understand the backflip. Newton's 1st law says that a body in motion or rest will stay in motion or rest unless acted on by another force. This can be understood as an athlete will not do a backflip unless they first initiate the movement by pushing force through the ground, which goes back up, allowing them to create that vertical jump. Next, force equals mass times acceleration. For someone who's a greater mass, for them to do the movement, they will have to create a bigger force because of the equation, mass times acceleration. Finally, Newton's 3rd law, which is that every action has an equal and opposite reaction, is seen as someone pushes into the ground can only push back as hard as they push down. And so if you don't have the muscles or strength to push down hard enough, you won't be able to produce the movement. So it's important to train the strength of your legs so that you can create that powerful vertical jump. Next, we're going to key in on the kinematic analysis. For the kinematics, the whole motion occurs in the sagittal plane with flexion and extension, or dorsiflexion and plantar flexion at all of our angles, at all of our joint angles, so that no other movement is occurring. Also, since they're all in the same plane, that means they're all occurring on the same axis, which is the medial lateral axis, which would go through like this, where we see flexion and extension. Finally, for the joint actions, I've already detailed them, but I felt it was pertinent to talk about it in the kinematic analysis. So here they are. Next, we're going to do 2 measurements of force application. The first, we used our work equation, which is force times distance. 1,000 newtons of work over 0.5 meters equals 500 joules. And then we're going to do our power equation, which is work over time. And that we use the same amount of joules over 0.5 seconds, which means that we're doing 1,000 watts of work. When looking at some of the common insufficiencies, it's really important that we key in on these and train them, because someone doing a backflip could easily hurt themselves if they had some of these insufficiencies. The first is decreased shoulder flexion. With a decreased shoulder flexion, you wouldn't be able to create that angular momentum of the upper body. The other is weak hip flexors. Hip flexion is also important to create that angular momentum, except through the lower body. And then the bridge between those two is our core. With a weak core, you won't be able to translate the force you put into a spin, and so that you're more likely to stall out at the top and you could land on your head or not on your feet. Some of the injuries are injuries to the knee extensor mechanism, as talked about in class, and these will present as patellar tendonitis or quad tendonitis. We also see some ACL injuries based on landing, where our force is taking us forward and our foot is planted in the ground. And then the final injury is one that I experienced when learning to do a backflip, and it was strain to the rectus abdominis muscles, and that could be from overuse or improperly warming up. Next, we're going to look at 2 exercises that we can apply to help someone who may present with these insufficiencies. The first is the box jump, and this is training those plyometrics, which will increase our ability to transmit power through all of our lower muscles and increase our triple extension. And then also we'll do some planks, which will help us to strengthen our core isometrically so that we can transmit that force from our feet to our whole body, so that we don't have that stall out that we talked about earlier. When going to the discipline of motor learning, we know that motor learning allows us to do multiple reps at a less risky movement, so that we can adopt the movement pattern when it comes time to needing to use it. We do this by doing things such as backward rolls, so that our body gets the idea of our knees going over our head. We can do jump tucks to train vertical jump, and also using our knees to bring them to our chest. We have assisted backflips with a spotter, which is a very common way to get the motor pattern down of trusting your knees to go over your head. And then finally, trampoline practice is where most people learn first how to do the movement, so that they can become more confident in the muscles and the motion that is required. We see 3 stages in motor learning, beginning with the cognitive stage, where someone's mainly in their brain trying to think of how to do the movement. Then they have the associative phase. After they've done a few reps, they're still learning how to tinker with their form so that they can create an efficient movement. And finally, you have the autonomous stage, which is where you don't even have to think and just do the movement. Associative to autonomous would be, for example, me to a high-level gymnast, where I still have to think a lot while I do the reps, where the gymnast can do it freely without thinking about it once. In conclusion, we know that to perform the standing backflip, you need to do really good vertical force production, have really good angular momentum, and then have proper joint sequencing. By using proper biomechanic principles, the movement becomes more efficient and you decrease your injury risk. Included are my references here. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video. I appreciate all the learning that's gone on through the first half of this semester, and I'm excited for more that's going to be coming. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.